It was an ordinary Sunday morning when I decided to spend some time in my front yard, arranging my garden gnome collection. Now, most people would think of a gnome as just a quirky decoration, but I was proud of mine. Each one was unique, and they added a touch of whimsy to my otherwise quiet suburban street. But little did I know, this harmless hobby would turn into the most dramatic, eye-opening experience of my life. The story begins with a single gnome, sitting proudly by my front porch. That innocent little figure was about to cause more chaos than I could have ever imagined. It all started when my neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, walked past my house while I was adjusting one of my gnomes. She stopped, turned, and stared at the little figure for what seemed like an eternity. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I could see her lips moving, muttering something under her breath. A few moments later, she walked back into her house without a word. I shrugged it off, thinking she was just being strange, as she often did. Mrs. Anderson was known for being a bit of a busybody, always poking her nose into other people's affairs. But things took a turn when she stormed back into my yard that evening. I was inside, enjoying my dinner when I heard a loud knock on the door. I opened it, expecting a delivery, but there stood Mrs. Anderson, her face red with anger. She didn't even greet me before launching into a tirade. "How dare you put that thing in your yard? It's an eyesore," she screamed, pointing at the gnome I had just placed near my garden. Confused, I asked her what the problem was. "That garden gnome is a violation of the neighborhood aesthetics," she snapped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to explain that it was just a decoration, something I enjoyed, but she was having none of it. She insisted it was a public disturbance and that it was ruining the look of the street. Now, I knew my rights and understood that the HOA, Homeowners Association, had a bit of a say in how things looked around here. But this seemed completely over the top. So, I calmly told Mrs. Anderson that I was within my rights to decorate my yard however I wanted as long as it didn't break any specific laws or HOA rules. She didn't take that well, and her eyes narrowed as she shot back, "You'll regret this. I'm calling the HOA and the police." At this point, I was just bewildered. A garden gnome? Really? Before I could even respond, she turned on her heel and stormed off. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I had never imagined that a simple garden decoration could cause so much drama. But, as I soon found out, Mrs. Anderson wasn't one to back down easily, and she wasn't finished yet. The next day, I received a letter from the HOA, claiming that my garden gnome was a violation of the community's rules. According to them, ornamental garden figures were not allowed in front yards because they could distract from the neighborhood's uniform aesthetic. I was floored. This had to be a joke, right? I had lived in this neighborhood for years, and no one had ever mentioned such a rule before. Still, I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. So, I called the HOA to clarify the situation. To my surprise, the person I spoke with seemed to take the matter very seriously. They told me that Mrs. Anderson had made an official complaint and that they would be scheduling a meeting to discuss the gnome issue. I was speechless. A gnome? Really? I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to cause trouble, just expressing myself in a harmless way, but they insisted that I attend the meeting. With no other choice, I agreed. As I prepared for the HOA meeting, I started to feel like this situation was spiraling out of control. What had started as a peaceful, quirky decoration was now something that felt bigger than I ever expected. Little did I know, this would only be the beginning of the most bizarre experience of my life. But more was yet to come, and I had no idea what I was about to face. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all some kind of bad dream. I put on my best, everything's fine face and drove to the community center. When I arrived, I was greeted by a room full of serious-looking homeowners and board members, all waiting to discuss the grave issue of my garden gnome. Mrs. Anderson was sitting front and center, looking smug as usual, like she had already won. I felt like I was walking into a courtroom, except the crime I was being charged with was a plastic garden decoration. The board members began with formalities, discussing various neighborhood concerns, until they finally got to the point. "Now, let's talk about the garden gnome in Mr. Thompson's yard," the president of the HOA said, flipping through papers. I could hear Mrs. Anderson's sharp intake of breath beside me, and I knew this was her moment. She immediately stood up and began to explain how the gnome was inappropriate and tacky, with an expression of disgust on her face. She even went as far as to call it a monstrosity that was ruining the overall beauty of the neighborhood. As she spoke, I tried to hold back my laughter. A garden gnome, a monstrosity? I couldn't believe how far this was going. But I kept my cool and waited for my turn. When it came time for me to speak, I took a deep breath and stood up. "I don't understand how a small, harmless garden gnome can be a threat to anyone or anything," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is a decoration that I put up in my yard to express myself. There are no rules in the HOA guidelines against it. It's not hurting anyone, it's just a gnome." The board members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, while others looked uncertain. Mrs. Anderson, however, wasn't backing down. She shot me a nasty glare and said, "You can't just put whatever you want in your yard. This is a community, and we all have to follow the rules. I've already spoken to the police about it, and they agree it's an eyesore." I was taken aback. The police? Over a gnome? Before I could respond, one of the board members, Mr. Jacobs, raised his hand. "Are we sure this is even an issue? I mean, it's just a decoration. We've had worse things in this neighborhood." He turned to Mrs. Anderson, who looked like she was about to explode. The room fell silent, and I could tell that some of the other board members were starting to doubt the seriousness of the situation. But Mrs. Anderson wasn't having it. "This is not just a decoration, Mr. Jacobs. It's an insult to the whole neighborhood," she snapped. At this point, I knew the situation was getting ridiculous. But I was ready to stand my ground. I calmly explained again that I wasn't breaking any laws or violating HOA guidelines. The gnome was a harmless object, and I had every right to decorate my yard as I pleased. I didn't expect the board to suddenly agree with me, but I hoped they would at least see how absurd Mrs. Anderson's complaint was. And then, just as I thought the meeting might be heading toward some resolution, Mrs. Anderson dropped a bombshell. "I've already called the police," she declared. "They're on their way to investigate this matter. This can't go on any longer." I felt my stomach drop. The police? Over a garden gnome? I couldn't believe it. Mrs. Anderson had actually called the cops on me. But before I could protest, a police officer walked into the meeting room, his uniform crisp and his face stern. "We received a call about a public disturbance regarding a garden gnome," he said, looking around the room. "Can someone explain to me what the issue is?" Mrs. Anderson immediately stood up, her voice rising with every word. "This man has a garden gnome in his yard, and it's causing a public disturbance. It's not just ugly, it's against the neighborhood rules." The officer looked around, clearly confused. He turned to me and asked, "Is this really why I'm here? Over a garden gnome?" I nodded, trying to keep a straight face. "Yes, officer. Apparently, this is a huge issue in the neighborhood." The officer blinked a couple of times, trying to process what was happening. He turned back to Mrs. Anderson and said, "I'm sorry, but I don't see how this is a police matter. There are no laws against garden gnomes, and as far as I'm aware, there's no HOA regulation that says you can't have one." Mrs. Anderson's face turned bright red, and she started to argue with the officer, but he wasn't having it. "I suggest we drop this issue and move on," he said, turning to the board. "This isn't something we need to involve the police in." The officer walked out, leaving Mrs. Anderson standing there in disbelief. The room was silent for a moment, and then the board president finally spoke. "Well, it seems there's no actual violation of the law here," he said. "And it's clear that this is not something the police need to get involved in. I think we can consider this matter closed." I was relieved, but I could tell Mrs. Anderson wasn't done yet. She huffed and puffed, clearly upset, but I had won this round. For now, at least. As I left the meeting, I couldn't help but think how crazy this whole situation had been. I had expected a neighborhood dispute, maybe some minor drama, but never anything like this. A garden gnome had somehow turned into a full-blown crisis. But I wasn't backing down. I was going to keep my gnome right where it was, and no one could make me change my mind. The battle wasn't over yet, but I was feeling pretty good about where things stood. A few days passed, and things seemed to quiet down after the meeting. My garden gnome stood proudly in my yard, untouched and unbothered. Mrs. Anderson, however, was not letting go of the situation. She continued to glare at my yard every time she walked past, but for the most part, the other neighbors seemed to forget about it. I thought it was all over. But then came the letter from the HOA. It arrived on a Thursday morning, and as I opened the envelope, my heart sank. The HOA was not done with me yet. The letter stated that, despite the board's decision, they were still considering the gnome a violation and demanded that I remove it from my front yard immediately. I couldn't believe it. After everything, the board had agreed that there was no issue, and yet here I was, facing another ridiculous demand. They even threatened to fine me if the gnome wasn't gone within a week. I knew I couldn't just back down. I had already dealt with the police and stood my ground with the HOA, and now they were trying to bully me into removing something that wasn't illegal or against any community guidelines. So, I called a lawyer. I explained everything to him, from the initial complaint to the police involvement, and he agreed that I had every right to keep my gnome in place. He also warned me that the HOA had no legal grounds to enforce any such rule unless it was clearly outlined in the bylaws. I was feeling a bit more confident, but the situation was far from over. That afternoon, I went out and took a picture of my gnome, just in case things escalated further. I also made sure to keep a copy of the HOA letter and the original letter I received after the meeting. I wasn't going to let them get away with bullying me over something so trivial. When I met with my lawyer again, he advised me to respond to the HOA letter, stating that I was within my rights to keep the gnome and that they needed to respect my property. I sent the letter the very next day, detailing everything I had done to comply with the law and how the HOA had no jurisdiction over my personal property. I made it clear that I would fight any attempts to remove my garden gnome and that I wasn't going to tolerate any further harassment. To my surprise, the HOA responded quickly this time. They said they would review my letter and get back to me in a few days. I couldn't help but feel a little smug. At least they were taking me seriously now. But then, just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more absurd, I was outside watering my plants when I heard a car pull up. I turned to see a local news van parked in front of my house. A reporter and cameraman stepped out, and the reporter approached me with a microphone. "Are you the homeowner with the garden gnome causing all the trouble in the neighborhood?" she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. I blinked, completely caught off guard. Yes, I guess that's me," I replied, still in shock. "What's this about?" The reporter smiled. "We've been hearing about the garden gnome controversy from your neighbors, and we'd love to hear your side of the story." I couldn't believe it. This had gone from a minor neighborhood spat to local news coverage. But, of course, I wasn't about to back down now. I agreed to do an interview, figuring it was better to get my side out in the open. The interview was short but impactful. I explained that it was just a harmless decoration, that I wasn't breaking any rules, and that the HOA had no right to demand its removal. I also talked about how ridiculous the situation had become and how I felt like I was being harassed over something that had no real impact on the neighborhood. The next day, my interview aired on the evening news. It quickly went viral in the local community. People were sharing the video, commenting on how absurd the whole thing was, and supporting my right to decorate my yard however I chose. Even some of Mrs. Anderson's friends started questioning her behavior. It was clear that the public opinion was on my side, and the HOA was beginning to realize that they had made a huge mistake. That night, I received a call from my lawyer, who told me that the HOA had officially dropped their complaint. They had received enough backlash from the community and understood that they couldn't legally force me to remove the gnome. I was ecstatic. It felt like I had won a major victory. The HOA had finally backed down, and my garden gnome was safe. The next time I saw Mrs. Anderson, she didn't even acknowledge me. She just walked past, looking flustered and defeated. I couldn't help but smile. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, but I had stood my ground, and in the end, I had triumphed. My gnome remained right where it belonged, and the neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson: don't mess with a man and his gnomes. As time went on, things slowly returned to normal. The buzz around the garden gnome faded, and the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythm. The HOA, having learned a lesson about overstepping its bounds, seemed to focus on more pressing matters, like the growing number of residents complaining about their broken sidewalks, rather than worrying about harmless garden decorations. My front yard became a symbol of quiet victory, a place where people would walk by and smile, not because of the gnome itself, but because they remembered the ridiculousness of the whole situation. But even though I had won, I still couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Anderson was lurking in the background, plotting her next move. She never confronted me again about the gnome, but I could see her watching from her window every time I worked in my garden or fixed something around the house. It was as if she was waiting for me to slip up. But I wasn't going to let that bother me. The gnome had become a sort of symbol of my resistance. I wasn't going to let anyone tell me what to do with my property, and if it meant standing firm over something as silly as a garden gnome, then so be it. Then, one day, I received an unexpected letter from the HOA. It wasn't the usual type of letter about violations or complaints. Instead, it was a formal letter of apology. The letter expressed regret for their involvement in the situation and acknowledged that the issue with the gnome had been a misunderstanding. They apologized for the harassment and assured me that they would no longer take issue with my yard decorations. I couldn't believe it. After all the drama, they were finally admitting they were wrong. But it wasn't just a letter. The HOA also included a small gift as a peace offering, a voucher for a local garden center. I stared at the card for a moment, unsure of how to feel. The whole thing seemed almost comical now. After everything I'd been through, now they wanted to send me a gift card to buy more garden gnomes? I chuckled to myself, realizing that the HOA had finally realized they'd gone too far. The very next weekend, I went to the garden center and picked out a few new gnomes. Nothing too extravagant, just a couple of quirky ones to add to my collection. It felt like a quiet victory, a sign that no one could tell me what to do with my yard. I placed the new gnomes alongside the original one and took a moment to admire the whimsical touch they brought to the garden. As I was finishing up, one of my neighbors, who had been watching the whole ordeal unfold, came over. He smiled and shook his head. "I never thought I'd see the day when a garden gnome would be the talk of the neighborhood," he said, chuckling. "But I'm glad you stood your ground. It's nice to see someone finally tell the HOA to take a step back." I smiled and nodded. Sometimes, it takes a little chaos to make people realize how small the problems are. I never thought it would come to this, but I'm glad it did. "The gnome stays," I said, laughing. From that day on, I never had another issue with Mrs. Anderson or the HOA. The garden gnome was still there, proudly sitting in my front yard, and it became a bit of a local legend. Whenever someone new moved into the neighborhood, the older residents would always tell the story of how the gnome caused such a stir and how I stood up to the HOA. It became a symbol of resistance, reminding everyone that sometimes, standing your ground on even the smallest of things can make a big difference. As for Mrs. Anderson, she finally gave up her crusade and focused on her own life, no longer concerned with what was in my yard. But I never forgot the lesson I had learned from all of this, that sometimes, you just have to fight for what's right, no matter how trivial it may seem. And in the end, I learned that a garden gnome can be more than just a quirky decoration. It can be a symbol of standing up for yourself, even when the world thinks it's silly. The whole garden gnome saga eventually became a funny story I would tell whenever people asked about my past neighborhood drama. It was hard to believe that something so small had turned into such a big deal, but looking back, I realized that it wasn't about the gnome at all. It was about control, boundaries, and standing up for your rights, even when it seemed like the issue was ridiculous. As the weeks passed, life returned to normal. Mrs. Anderson kept to herself, and the HOA seemed to have learned their lesson about picking battles that weren't theirs to fight. My neighborhood became a little more peaceful, and I often found myself sitting in my yard, enjoying the quiet that came with no more drama. The gnome, still in its spot by the garden, became a sort of personal victory monument. Eventually, new neighbors moved in, and as I got to know them, the topic of the infamous garden gnome came up. It had become a sort of legend in the neighborhood, one of those stories that everyone shared. People who had never even seen the gnome would smile and nod when they heard the tale. They'd say things like, "I've heard about the gnome story. It's kind of a big deal around here, huh?" I realized that the gnome had become a symbol, not just of my stubbornness, but of a community that had come together to remind the HOA that it didn't control every aspect of our lives. It had caused a stir at the time, but now it was just a quirky piece of my garden, a silly decoration that still got some curious glances from visitors, but that was it. It had sparked change, and it had sparked laughter, and most importantly, it had brought a community together. Looking back, I couldn't help but smile every time I saw the gnome. It was no longer just a decoration. It was my story. It was proof that sometimes, you have to stand up for what's right. Even if it's as simple as keeping a garden gnome in your yard. And every time I passed by it, I remembered that in this life, sometimes the smallest things make the biggest impact. The gnome stayed, and so did I, proud, unyielding, and happy to have stood my ground.